In this video, we are going to continue our detailed disassemblies, and we are going to focus on the receiver and bolt in this video. But before we get started, there's a few things I want to mention again. I would recommend watching or skimming this entire video just to make sure you've got the process down, that you know what is coming up and there isn't any surprises if you are following along. Second is, when disassembling a firearm and working with spring tension, like I mentioned last time, I recommend just a pair of safety glasses to keep errant springs or plungers from getting to your eyes. And finally, if you notice that you are missing or have a damaged part, I will again leave links in the description of this video on where you can get parts. So let's go ahead and get started on this receiver and bolt group. So first thing you're going to want to do, as with any gun, make sure it's clear. So we'll press our bolt catch, charge the barrel, and there's that dummy round that I had in there. Nothing in the chamber, nothing in the magazine. We are good to go. So we will start by taking the barrel and fore-end group off with our strap wrench here. Not quite. All right, so we will set that aside. And now we will disassemble our takedown feature, removing the buttstock and trigger group from the bolt and receiver. For that, you're going to want to release your bolt down. So I just take a screwdriver, push it up against the bolt face, release your bolt catch, and just let it down. And that relieves the spring tension on the spring that runs down through the buttstock here. Now you'll press on your lock lever here, unscrew, and pops right free. So now we will set this aside as well. We'll get to that in the next video. And now we are left with our bolt and receiver. There's kind of two ways to get the bolt out and to get all the guts out in here. The first way I demonstrated in the basic disassembly video, basic disassembly and cleaning video, and it's where you just kind of get stuff a little bit out of the way to where you can then get the bolt out as soon as possible. In this video, I am going to basically work my way down to the bolt by getting all of these parts out first. If you don't want to do this way, if you want to just get your bolt out as soon as possible, go back and take a look at the basic disassembly and cleaning video, and that will show you how to do that. But for the time being, we are going to basically just go in chronological order of how to get down to the bolt. So first up is going to be your carrier. And your carrier is what carries shells up into and in front of the bolt. So there is a tiny little leg thing that comes off of this side of the carrier, and all you really need to do is barely wedge something in there and pull up and out. You can really even just do it with your fingers. Just pull this leg here up a little bit, and it pivots right out. So you'll turn it around. There is a carrier screw, and you will unscrew that. And when you get that screw out, your carrier is made up of 2 legs. And that will allow you to kind of just shimmy around. One leg comes out, and then the other leg comes out. So we'll set this aside for just a second, the receiver, and focus on our carrier here. Just give you a better look at it. So you've got a left and a right leg. There's little notches where they fit together, and your screw obviously holds them together. So go ahead and set your screw aside. And on these legs here, the leg with the little foot on it, there is nothing more you can do with that. That's just all one solid piece. So you can set that aside as well. On the other leg, there are some moving parts on the back end of it here. You've got your carrier cam. In here runs a carrier cam plunger and a carrier cam plunger spring. And what I have found the easiest way to get that out is so this is the back end of your carrier cam plunger. And what you want to do is you're gonna grab onto that, pull it this way, and that will pull against spring tension. And then if you turn it over, your carrier cam will just fall out. So as you grab onto that and pull, your carrier cam falls out, and you're going to want to keep your finger in front of there. So your carrier cam came out of that hole, and on the front side here is where the spring is pressing against. And if you turn that, then pops out your carrier cam plunger and your carrier cam plunger spring. I'll just set those right there for now. And the only thing left to do on this piece, and I do not have a punch small enough to get to it. That pin right there is your carrier roll pin, and that is holding in, get here in the camera a little better. So your carrier roll pin is right there, and that is holding in your carrier roll, which rolls around that pin. So like I said, I don't have a punch small enough to get that out, but all you would basically do is you could probably go either way, punch that out, your carrier roll would just slide right out once that pin isn't through it, and that would be the only 2 pieces left on this leg here. And what your carrier roll sits up against, we'll try to stick with the appropriate groups here. So when your carrier is in the gun, like so, that carrier roll hits up against your carrier spring in there. And what you will do, the easiest way is to take a small screwdriver, and I apologize if I bump the camera at all during this process. So your carrier spring is like a V with a loop in it, and then it comes down and a little foot comes up into a hole right there. So there's a little place where you could get a little wedge of a screwdriver down in there, and it'll pull, maybe. So it pulled down out of that hole. I don't know if you can see that right there. Little foot pulls out of that hole, you wedge down, and it just pops right out. So it was sitting in there like so. And that little 90-degree angle right there is the hole, or is the foot that was coming up into that hole right there. And your carrier on your carrier roll just sit up against that, and that's what keeps spring tension on your carrier. So we will try to keep all of these groups together for the time being until we do a full, or until we reassemble everything. So just keep those in a group, and we will move on to the next piece in the receiver. All right, so next up is going to be our bolt catch here. And there's three parts. There's the bolt catch cap, and the bolt catch spring. And the spring, like the last one we just took out and many others, has again a 90-degree angle on it that comes up into a hole right here. So you will wedge your screwdriver up there, and it'll pop out of that hole right there. You see that? And then you'll just wedge down and out, and it comes out just like that. And that foot, or that angle, was up into that hole. And that spring sits on either side of this this peak here. So the spring clicks over that into the lock or the unlock, or the catch or uncatch position. So now to get this piece out, your bolt catch and your bolt catch cap, I tend to put the catch leg up against one of the rails in there, and then I use a piece of rubber strap that I cut off of my strap wrench, just a little length off of there, and some vice grips. There is it's really hard to tell, especially if it's well worn. There's a tiny little seam, I believe it's right there, and we'll see once I start unscrewing it. But that's where these two pieces connect. So I'll put that leg up against one of the rails, wrap this rubber piece around there. Take your vice grips that are, or any sort of locking pliers that are fairly tight. You're going to want to have a real good hold on this piece. And I use the rubber for grip, but also so I don't tear up and gouge pieces. So when it's up against that rail, it kind of locks it in place. Let me zoom out a little bit. Locks up against one of those rails, and then that should give you the leverage to begin unscrewing. And I'll take this off and check every once in a while and make sure it's coming off. And as you can see, that seam is now quite large, so you know it's coming off of there. So we will just continue taking this off. I loosen these up now, I don't need them so tight. And this piece, it tends to stay on there pretty good. I'm going to move to a little piece of leather. You can also use leather if you want. It just seems like the rubber, I get a little better grip to start with. But the reason it's on there so good and hard to get off, you will see once we get it off that the male threaded portion has like little prongs. It's been cut and split. Might need to go back to this rubber here to act like its own locking system. So these two halves don't come apart while you're shooting or disassembling. So it just doesn't work loose over time. So once you get your cap off, you now have clearance to bring that out of there. So your male, let me get a little rag and wipe that off. So your male threads here have a split in them, and they're flared out to when you screw it in, it kind of wedges up against the female threads on the inside there, so they don't just work loose. And in my original cleaning and disassembly of this gun, I have since put grease, a little bit of grease on there so they don't seize up, because the first time I took this apart, this was incredibly hard to get off. I actually had to lock on the inside and then unscrew on the outside here to get those off. But, so as far as your bolt catch is concerned, you now have your bolt catch cap, and your bolt catch spring. So we will keep this little group together, set them aside, and move on to the next pieces. All right, next up is going to be, so you're going to want to move your bolt to the rear, out of the way. Next up is going to be your cartridge cutoff and your cartridge cutoff spring. And we did remove this in the basic disassembly video as well. So there's a little notch in between your spring and this lip of the receiver. Put a screwdriver in there. You're going to wedge down and out, and your cartridge cutoff spring pops right out. So on this one, the 90-degree angle is down, and it goes into the actual cartridge stop. And it's this little swoop right here that just fits up under the receiver. So there's that, and now your cartridge cutoff is just loose in there, and it just shakes right out. So it was sitting in there like that, and the 90-degree angle on your spring fits in that hole right there, like so. So we will set these aside and go to our next piece. Okay, so next up we will do our cartridge stop, which is going to be this L-shaped piece here that is on the bottom side of the bolt. You've got your cartridge stop plunger, and underneath that plunger is your cartridge stop plunger spring. So on your cartridge stop plunger here, you're going to press down and sort of just pivot it out of the way. So you'll press down on the plunger, and so the cartridge stop, now you want to see the plunger is just behind this ledge here. So if you put your fingers over that and just kind of keep wedging it down, once it clears, so there's just your cartridge stop plunger with the spring behind it. Your cartridge stop will come out of there. There's that L shape. And then your plunger and your spring, just give them a tap, and they come out of that hole that was right there. So there's your cartridge stop plunger, cartridge stop plunger spring, and they sit. So if we're looking at the side of our bolt here, how this was in there, you've got your tapered cartridge stop plunger, which fits into the tapered hole of your cartridge stop, and then your spring just sits right behind it. So we'll move these aside, keep those together. And at this point, your bolt can come out. So just press it forward, keep pressing it forward, and your bolt is out. We will focus on the bolt in a little bit, but for the time being, we still have a couple more parts left in the receiver here. And one of those parts is your bolt stop and your bolt stop spring. So your bolt stop is running right there. That little ledge is part of it, and the spring is up under there, holding it in place. And this is going to be, at least on my gun, this is going to be one of your more difficult springs to get out and back in. It's just kind of the way that it's wedged up in there and back in there. It's a little different than the other ones that we've looked at, but it still does have that 90-degree foot that goes down into your bolt stop here. And I may, depending on how long it takes me to get this out, I may fast forward some of this film, because it's just a lot of tinkering and wedging and getting things just right to get it to pop out of there. But I will play around with it, see if I can get it out of there. And as you can see, the spring tension is forcing it down, which, yes, it's technically up, but since we're working upside down, it's going down. So usually just wedge up underneath this first piece here. All right, I got that first foot out. That was pretty quick. So I went up and I just put my screwdriver down in the receiver. Hopefully you saw it, and pressed down and tried to, what I could, rotate it towards the center of the receiver. And as you can see, that first leg has now popped out. And if we can get this second leg, I might need to go to a little bigger screwdriver. If we can get that second leg up over that ledge, maybe. It's been a while since I've completely disassembled this, but a lot of times you just have to, push things and move things to see what looks like will be the best plan of action moving forward. And once you have that 90-degree foot out, there's nothing holding it from sliding in the rails, type rails that it's up in there. So you may have to continue to slide back and forth to get things where you want it. And there's another reason for safety glasses, although it did not hit me in the eyes. That came out of there with considerable velocity behind it. Hit me in the chest, but had that been my eyes, that might not have turned out so well. So it was sitting in there like so. That 90-degree foot is down in your bolt stop here, and it was basically just all of this was compressed down to make it so your bolt stop presses down. And very similar to your other cartridge cutoff piece, once the spring is out, it's just loose in there. So give it a little shake and it'll come right out. So there's a little hole that the spring sits down in, and there's a groove right there that your other leg, when it's finally in there, that your other leg of the spring sits on, and this is all compressed flat like so. So there's quite a bit of tension on that guy, and you really just kind of have to wedge and prod and poke until, in my case, it just came flying out of there. So we will set this piece aside. So that's your bolt stop and your bolt stop spring. We will set that little group aside, and we now have just one more thing to take out of our receiver here. That final piece left in the receiver is your takedown screw bushing. Right there. And what that does, or what that is, so on your buttstock and trigger group, where your takedown screw screws into, so when you tighten it down, what it is screwing into is the takedown screw bushing. So we'll get that back out of there. And there are slots on it, like a flathead screwdriver. So what I use is just a real long flathead to go through the receiver to the back. And again, depending on how old and dirty your gun is, If this has never been done, it might be kind of difficult. Mine is fairly clean, but you will then just unscrew it. Regular threads, it's a lefty loosey, righty tighty. Then when it comes out, there it is. So these threads screw into the receiver. The threads on the inside are what your takedown screw screws onto. So that is your takedown screw bushing. We will set that aside. And at this point, you are left with nothing but the receiver. There is not a piece left in there. This is just a solid chunk of steel that you can now get all cleaned up, oiled up, whatever you desire to do with it. But we are still left with the bolt. There's a couple things to take apart on the bolt. So we will set our receiver aside and move on to the bolt. All right, on your bolt here, you've got a couple different groups of parts. And to get your locking block and your locking block operating rod off of the bolt, you're going to push right here on your firing pin that's under spring tension. So you'll press and rotate this assembly up and pull straight out. Just slides right out. And then you can release the spring tension on your firing pin. Set that aside for just a second. Your firing pin shimmies out of there. And then you can take off your firing pin spring. And then there you have your firing pin spring and your firing pin. I'll put those back together so I don't lose either one. And set that aside. Here is your locking block operating rod, and your locking block operating rod pin. It just holds them together. It looks as though it was staked, those two divots on either side. Once it gets in, they punch it so the metal, it displaces a little bit of metal and it stakes it in place. But I believe, based on how it's moving around right now, and on my original disassembly, when I took it apart, I believe I took that out. So we will go ahead and punch that out. I might not have a punch that small. So what I use, or is able to use, is a nail that obviously you cut the sharp end off. You don't have to cut the head off of it, but for this case I have. And for a punch block, I just use a bicycle pedal. It's rubberized, it's pretty easy, it's cheap. We'll see. And I didn't even need to, yeah, maybe a little bit. Came out almost all the way with my hands, so I must have taken it out before. But once you get that punched out, you now have your separate pieces, which again are your locking block operating rod, and your locking block operating rod pin. So we will set those aside and keep going on the bolt here. The only thing left on your bolt is going to be your extractor spring, you can kind of see in there, and your extractor pin, which is what it pivots off of. And I have a little smaller nail that just kind of a finishing nail that I've cut the point off of. And you have your hole down here on the bottom that, and again, if your gun's real dirty, this may be harder, but I believe I just push this out with my hand. As you push up, your pin's gonna start coming out. Put a thumb or a finger on your extractor because it is under a little bit of spring tension. So just push that out. Here your pin falls out, and then pull your punch or whatever you're using out of there. Here's your extractor and your extractor spring. Extractor, extractor spring, extractor pin. Set those aside, and I want to talk about what this is right here on the back of your bolt. And we will bring the receiver in as well to talk about what its function is. If you recall on the last video, which was the detailed disassembly of the barrel and forend, we talked about the rubber buffers that are right here. So upon firing this gun, there's a few systems in place that are absorbing recoil, dampening recoil, using that recoil to cycle the gun. So when you pull the trigger, your bolt and barrel move rearward, right, like so in the forend. When the barrel gets to the end of its travel, it is hitting those rubber buffers. When the bolt, which will sit in there like so, when this assembly reaches the back of the receiver, your bolt buffer here absorbs or dampens a little bit of the recoil. So we'll insert our bolt in now that nothing's in there. It can slide completely free. And when it reaches the back of the receiver, it smacks it. But the first thing, and hopefully the only thing that is hitting, is your bolt buffer here. Now this is not original. This is that rubberized cork that you get out of liquor bottles. So there's, from what I've seen in liquor bottles, I don't happen to drink, but from what I've seen, there's regular cork, like wine cork, that is the natural product from a cork tree. And then there's a more modern material that is almost like a foam / rubber that is used in place of cork. That is what I have put in here. And basically, so that dot, as you can see, that was the center of what was originally a round cork. And I cut it to shape and the depth that I needed. And I'm looking for something that I can point with. So this area in here, it runs to probably right there. It doesn't go any deeper than that. So this bolt buffer here goes from here to about here, and obviously is that kidney type shape. The original that was in here, I saved some pieces. The original was like the ring buffers in the barrel buffers, was just completely hard, solid, probably wasn't doing anything to dampen recoil. This is a portion of it. And it feels pretty hard. And what I had to do is basically just take a little drill bit, drill in there, drill a bunch of little holes, and then with the screwdriver, kind of scrape it out. So that is the original material. It appears to be almost like the barrel buffers, a woody cork type substance that I guess after almost 100 years of solvents, humidity, drying out, basically rinse, lather, rinse, repeat of climatic conditions, it was useless. So I found a modern material that is easy to source to put in there. Upon firing, it kind of frayed the edges a little bit. It cleaned itself up because after shooting it a bunch, and it smacking the back of the receiver, it's gonna kind of peel off and fray those edges to what it looks like now. And when I put it in there, I just put a little dollop. So I cut it to shape, kept fitting and shaping, put a little dollop of hot glue in there, pressed it down quite firmly, and this hasn't given me any issues with the 50 to 75 rounds that have gone through this gun since. So if you are looking for this piece, need this piece, you can source it from the rubberized modern cork that you find in liquor or wine bottles, or you can use other materials to your liking. Other things I have tried are shoe goo, hot glue, like the silicone that you put around windows, Flex Seal, anything that I could like pour in there that would rubberize and harden after curing. But those, upon hitting the back of the receiver repeatedly, those just mash in there and don't retain or rebound to their shape. So hopefully that explains that, and I didn't rant too much on that, but that's what that is if you were curious and where you could get some. Now that we are completely disassembled, now it's time to start the reassembly process. We will start with our extractor, extractor spring, and extractor pin. On our bolt here, so your extractor spring will go down in the hole down there. Might need something to press it down in all the way. Your extractor will sit against it, and your pin will go down through that hole and down through your extractor. And you'll want to make sure that your extractor spring is straight and doesn't get bound up in there. And you'll just have to line it up to where you can, best you can. Sometimes you can get it to where you can see through that hole, but for the most part you'll just have to press it in and shimmy around until you find it and press it flush. You could even go a little more than flush, and there's your extractor. Next up will be our, well, we'll do this first, your locking block operating rod, and locking block operating rod pin. So you'll line those up. I don't believe there was any particular way that came out. Might just have to try and see what fits in the easiest. And right back in there. So that is now together. Next up will be your firing pin spring and firing pin that you will push in there. Make sure it's loose and free on the spring. There's no binding. And to put your locking block assembly back in. Your firing pin needs to be pushed in past that divot, slide straight in, rotate down, and it is locked back in there. So we will set our bolt aside, now our complete bolt group, our bolt assembly there, and move on to our takedown screw bushing. And I need to grab my big screwdriver, and you might have to fidget with this a little bit because it's kind of hard to keep it on the screwdriver while getting it to the exact spot you need. There we go. So I've got those started. I know a lot of people fast forward through threading stuff on. I'm not a particular fan of that, although it saves you guys time, or it saves the viewer time. I like people to see the actual time that it takes to do a certain task. So you'll get down, don't have to get real tight, just snug on that. So that was our takedown screw bushing is back in there now. Moving on, and I'll zoom out so you can see. So these are the order that we took the groups out. And so we will just reverse that order. So we will go to our bolt stop and our bolt stop spring, which is going to be the more difficult of all of them to get back in. So your bolt stop has like a double ledge here on it. The bottom ledge fits into just underneath a slot in there, and if it can move freely up and down, you know you're in the right spot. So this bolt stop spring, it's going to be oriented like this. And if you recall, when we took it out, your 90-degree foot will sit in that hole on the actual bolt stop. And this leg, the other leg of the spring, will sit in that notch right there. And it'll obviously be compressed down, but that will be the final position of that part. So slide that in there. And since this one is the most difficult, it might be hard to see on camera sometimes, but there's almost like a groove that angles in. It goes down and in. It's almost like for your spring to slide in and then down the length of the bolt stop. You're gonna push it in, and I need to find a little screwdriver right there. So when you eventually get it in, you're gonna lift this leg of your spring here up into that little hole. I have experienced in the past where this leg goes behind the other leg. So as it should be sitting in there like that, and then your leg comes up and sits in that slot. I have in disassembling prior to this in the past, I've gotten it to where when you leverage this leg, the 90-degree leg, up and in, it actually ends up behind this leg. That will do you no good. The part will probably spring out of there upon putting other pieces in, and you just have to make sure everything is in that hole, in that slot where it's supposed to be. And this one will take, unless you get lucky, will take some fiddling around with to get in. And this may be the only time that I fast forward, depending on how many attempts this takes me. So you want to leverage that leg up and in. Another reason for safety glasses. Didn't hit my eyes, but came shooting back. And as you probably heard, it went shooting across the room, so I had to go find it. Okay, try this again here. And if things don't work, just try to remain calm and patient. This will probably be the most frustrating part. Sorry about the camera movement. But you just have to keep working at it. Try different angles, try different tools. Make sure you got your safety glasses on. Excuse me. And if anyone out there knows a secret to this, I don't think anyone will based on the content that is out there on the internet. But if anyone has a secret for this piece, I would be appreciative. There's just so much tension on this one from different angles. It seems like no matter what you do, it wants to pop out of there. But I know that the guy who built it got it in there. I've taken it apart and gotten it back in there once before. So I know it's possible. So we need to get that leg up into that little hole right there, while keeping everything in. And what I might do is take my little leather scrap and lock that one edge down so it can't come out while I am putting pressure on it. So just putting it on this edge right here, the spring, because that's the piece that wants to, you know, pop out when you try to lift that leg up in. I don't want it to be crazy tight, but I want it to be tight enough to hold it in place. And your tool can't be in your way either. Looks like that might work. All right, so I got that leg in, but it is not, hopefully you can see the leg is right there. The hole is forward just a touch. So if you can put it in to that loop and drag it forward. All right, snapped in there. But it looks like this loop here still isn't quite in place. It needs to be pushed back. If I can get, this isn't necessarily for camera's sake, but for mine, so I can see where it is. Just needs to be pushed back up and in. All right, so the spring, it looked like it was, and you're looking up here now, it looked like it wanted to come up over that ledge, so I just pushed down and up in, and it popped into place. So I think that's the trick. I think I just found the trick. You need something to hold that top edge in while you leverage that bottom leg up and in. So that was our bolt stop, and bolt stop spring is now in. We'll now move to putting our bolt assembly back in, along with our cartridge stop plunger, and cartridge stop plunger spring. So we will slide our bolt in, making sure your grooves and rails, slots and rails line up. And so now your bolt stop that we just put in before is preventing the bolt from moving rearward. So what you need to do is lift up that ledge right there, lift it up so the bolt can go past. Just lift up a little bit till it's on the top of the bolt and slide it back. And you're going to want your bolt about in the center. That way you've got access to both sides for our cartridge stop. So your cartridge stop has another lower lip on it. That lip slides into a slot in your L-shaped place on the bottom of your bolt, and then it just drops in. And you can then pivot it up and down in there. If it's in the right spot, you can pivot it enough. Pivot it out of the way, in the way. So your spring, cartridge stop plunger spring, is going to drop down in that little hole. Cartridge stop plunger, tapered end. So it's got a flat end and a tapered end. Tapered end will face outward. You'll drop it down in the hole with the tapered end up. And then when you press your cartridge stop up onto it, you'll need to press down on that plunger until it gets underneath it, and then just continue pressing until your plunger pops up through that little hole. So that was the reinsertion of the cartridge stop plunger, and cartridge stop plunger spring. So next up will be our cartridge cutoff and our cartridge cutoff spring. So you're going to move your bolt to the rear, out of the way. Your cartridge cutoff spring has a 90-degree leg on it, or foot. That foot will go into the hole that is on the cartridge cutoff, and it will sit in there like so. This has a lip on it that will fit into a slot down in there, and it just goes up and down. You will find that hole with that little foot, and then just press this loop piece underneath that edge of the receiver. And you can do it with your thumb. If you can't, you could maybe use a screwdriver, but then you will test it and look to make sure it went down in that hole and make sure the spring didn't go behind the cartridge cutoff. So that is back in place, and we will now move to the bolt catch cap, and bolt catch spring. So you're going to flip your receiver around, and your bolt catch with the leg on it will go in, and the threaded portion will come out. So if you're looking at the front of the receiver and it's upside down, your threaded portion will come out to the right. And you can probably start this cap by hand, and I still have a little bit of grease on there from the first time, so I'll just leave that grease on there. I started by hand. Make sure you find the threads, you're not cross threading. Okay, then I will take my vice grips and my rubber piece here, and latch down on the cap. Maybe a little too tight. And then on your bolt catch in here, just line it up against one of the rails so that you can turn the cap, but the catch part won't turn. And I will zoom out so I'm not all over the frame. I need to find whatever ledge works best for you. And then just slowly thread that on there. And you will thread it on there until, so as you can see, the gap between the cap and the catch, the bolt catch, is shrinking. And if you remember from when we disassembled it, that you couldn't really even tell that there was a gap. So you'll screw it down until that gap disappears, and my little rubber piece is just sliding. Now I'm not tightening it down anymore. So that'll probably be good. So there is your bolt catch and bolt catch cap back together. Now your bolt catch has two valleys in it and a high center point. Your spring will be on either side of that high point. And I found it easiest to just put it in so this slot here, which is where this bottom leg runs along, so that slot is lined up with one of those two valleys. Doesn't matter which one. But you'll put that leg down in there, and this 90-degree foot will be wedged down under and into that little locking hole. So just wedge it down in there, slide it until it pops up into that hole, and now your spring rides in those two valleys on either side of that high point. So that is back together. We will now move to our carrier and its pieces. So we will get our carrier pieces in here. Our left and right leg. So on the, it really depends on which way you're looking at the gun. If it's upside down, it would be your right leg. If it's right side up, be your left leg. So we'll just say it's the leg that doesn't have the foot or that little notch on it that everything goes back into. So your carrier cam plunger spring, and your carrier cam. So your plunger and your spring go together like so, and you can put that assembly into the hole that it came out of, and you can see on this top hole here where the carrier cam actually goes down in, you can see that you need to push those in far enough to get that out of the way of the carrier cam. And what works for me is pushing it in with any sort of punch or pin until you get it far enough back to where the plunger comes out the back. So when you get it to that point, you can then grab it with, I'm using needle nose here. Put your carrier cam in position with downward pressure and continue to pull. You're going to want to continue to pull that plunger and spring out of the way until your cam drops in. And while you're doing that, probably be wise to keep a finger or something in front of the plunger and spring. That way if you accidentally let it go, it'll just hit your finger and it won't fly across the room. And I need a thicker punch because that nail is kind of hard on the thumb. That might be too big though. Nope. So push in, push in where it gives you enough room to grab the back end of that plunger. Grab firmly, and I might be enough out of the way. Continue to pull back until your carrier cam just snaps down into place. Get these tools out of the way. So that is back together. Two legs of the carrier, our carrier screw, and our carrier spring here. We'll insert our carrier spring. And how this is going to go in here is there's, like all the other springs, there's a 90-degree foot on it. That 90-degree foot is going to go up into that little hole right there. So you'll just set it down on the ledge that's down under there. Kind of get it in somewhat position. So now that foot is lined up with the hole. All I've got to do is press it down and in. So it's under that ledge, and just slide it down to the right position. Get a little more leverage with a bigger screwdriver. And it just popped right up into that slot. So now with your carrier, you will place these two cylinder pieces that are coming out. Those two cylinder pieces go into corresponding holes on either side of the receiver. So you'll put those in first, and you'll make sure that your spring, the leg on this spring that we just put in, is lining up in your carrier roll right there. That spring leg will sit right in there. So you can just line it in there, put that cylinder in the hole, and as you can see, that makes spring tension on there. And wherever your bolt is, just get it to where you need to so you can move around. Slide your other piece down in there. Shimmy it back and forth until your carrier is lined up. Carrier is lined up. Everything looks good. Place your carrier screw in there. Screw it down. Just until snug, maybe a little bit more than snug, but then make sure you're flush enough on there to where it doesn't impede its movement. Make sure you're still on your spring back here, and you will squeeze your legs in so it can clear that foot. Squeeze in, press into the receiver, and you are back together. So that is your bolt and receiver assembly. I will kind of clean up my tools here, and we will put the gun in its entirety back together. Okay, now we've got our bolt and receiver group, our barrel and fore-end group, and our buttstock and trigger group. Doesn't matter what order you put them together, just depends on what position your bolt is in. So if your bolt is forward, you would put it on your buttstock and trigger group. If your bolt is to the rear, you would put on your barrel and fore-end group first. I will go ahead and put on the barrel and fore-end group first. Just line it up there and screw it back on. Just until snug. And now you're gonna, since your bolt is all the way to the rear, you're gonna reach in and push out of the way your bolt stop. That is stopping your bolt from moving forward. Push your bolt all the way forward and make it so your locking block operating rod, that ball joint on the end of it, lines up with the cup that goes down into the spring that runs down in there. Like so. Press down on your takedown screw lock. Screw down your takedown screw. And there you go. We will put this dummy round in here. Push your bolt catch. Pop our dummy round in there. Close the bolt. Safety works. Trigger works. And we will just leave the hammer down in the fired position while we store it and get ready for the next video. I hope you enjoyed this video. Hopefully it helped you out if you needed it. And our next video, we will be taking a look at the trigger group and buttstock disassembly. All of its internal parts, a detailed disassembly of that. So thanks for watching, and we will see you on the next one.